Hello everybody and welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a look at Haris teams in Infinity and 5 and doing a bit of a deep dive on a particular aspect of Haris teams I find interesting and like to think about when I'm building a Haris team or a list at large. So first things first, this episode's been largely inspired by the recent Loss of Lieutenant podcast episode on fire teams in general. This little Haris team guide, it's going to be fairly focused, it's not going to cover everything, so I highly suggest checking this episode out. It's a really good one, not just for Haris teams, but also for duos and cores as well. They did a fantastic job on it. I'm going to try to leave a link in the description if YouTube lets me. But otherwise, yeah, let's get to the video. So what is a Haris team? Haris teams are made up of exactly 3 units, no more, no less. They're usually used for force multiplication with the special die, and or to get some more efficient movement out of your units. And with the changes in N5, most armies, and I think every army in the game, has access to at least one Haris team. So it's pretty important. Now, Haris teams have a general pattern to them. Most Haris teams are made up of a shooter, a specialist, and some spice, the 3 S's. You've always got a shooter and a specialist, who are fairly self-explanatory, but the spice slot is kind of a bit more spicy. They can be a CC specialist, someone good with vision control, someone with a tinbot, or another kind of specialized equipment like disco ballers, which could also count as vision control, pitchers, mine layers, that sort of thing. So let's look at a couple of typical Haris teams with this framework in mind. Over on the left here, we have a Corregidor fire team, with our shooter slot, taken by the Mobile Regatta heavy machine gun. He's got a BS-13 heavy machine gun, he's got 2 wounds, and he's got quite decent armor. So he's the shooter, he's front of the team, he's taking the longer range gunfights. Next up, we've got the specialist, who in this case is Jazz, who's a Whip 14 hacker. She has a little bit of overlap in the spice department, having some specialized equipment being pitchers, but she plays the role of the specialist. Last up, we have the Spice, who is the Mobile Regatta tinbot with multi-rifle. He not only fits in really well with the shooter, but the spice he puts in being that tinbot really amplifies what the specialist can do, and really supports the team in quite a spicy way. On the other side, we've got Svalheima. We have a Vargur as our shooter, with a heavy rocket launcher. He's got a BS-13 heavy rocket launcher, albeit on -6, but he is also a specialist. He's a Whip 13 forward observer, and overlaps a bit with that specialist category. Then for our primary specialist, we've got a Vargur forward observer, with rifle, heavy flamer, and then a disco bowler. And here, this Vargur is also slightly overlapping in the spice category, with some specialized equipment. But nonetheless, this Vargur is our primary specialist. Then last up, in the spice category, we've got our CC monster, Shona, who can really carve things up in close combat, and also has 2-ish wounds with 1 wound, no wounding cap, meaning she gives the team a bit of resilience. So this is what typical Haris teams look like. A shooter, who can take those long-range gunfights, a specialist, who's good at pressing the buttons, and then Spice, an X-factor in the Link team that gives them a little bit extra. Without the Spice, you're usually just looking at a duo. And while we can see that some units overlap with each other, what we get to see is that they all fit into a distinct category, even though they share, some roles, some equipment, that sort of thing. There are also some non-typical Haris team examples. Like on the left here is what I call a linchpin fire team, where you have one key unit that's doing quite a bit, and then 2 units that really just boost its capability, but don't really do much for the team on their own or have a distinct role other than a booster. In this example, we've got Deferzen, who's a shooter as well as a specialist, and is really doing everything offensive, or most things offensive or mission-related in that team. Then you've got 2 boosters. You've got 2 Teutonic Knights. One of them has a tinbot, which is going to give Deferzen that -3 firewall, but they're also going to give Deferzen an extra die being together. Additionally, they're both 2 wound models with good close combat capabilities, who can either be positioned ahead of Deferzen, so someone will have to go through them to get to him, or can be the tip of the spear if the team pushes up enough to get into a very close range confrontation. The next type of fire team I've got is a Tunguska Harries, which I call a lamb fire team. So the first model you've got there is the lamb, the sacrificial lamb, where the team is really set up as a duo with something else tacked on the side, with the understanding that that unit's probably going to die or is going to be quote unquote used, and then what's left as a duo is going to happily move out. So we've got Perseus and a Stemplerzond. Perseus is the shooter and the spice, the Stempler is the specialist, just within their own duo. And they're a duo I'd run quite a bit in Tunguska anyway. But then you tack on Miranda with marksmanship, Mim -6 with an emitter, who's a really great ARO piece, or first turn shooter to lock up some heavy infantry. But she is very squishy. She loses a dice roll, she dies, that's it. But the duo that's present here, in Perseus and the Stempler, get to give her a special die and get really good utility out of Miranda before she eventually drops, where then the fire team can efficiently move out with the understanding that that's the game plan. So those are two non-typical Harries team examples. Now, the last fire team really emphasizes the core of this video, which is how will the cookie crumble? I think when you're building a Harries team, the most important thing is to understand what everyone contributes to that fire team, but more importantly, what's going to happen to that fire team as it falls apart. Infinity really is a game where you need to plan for things going wrong. It's fine enough to have a list that does well when you're ahead, but when you're behind or when something's happened, that's when your list really needs to perform. Now, as we saw in the previous example links, pure Harries teams are relatively uncommon. That's because three models that share a name or even share a keyword sometimes don't have a diverse enough skill set to justify cost or justify overlapping roles, where you're usually ending up with two units who have purity and one who's just sort of hanging off to the side. So we can see here in the example with the Vargar team, both Vargar are giving us a bit of purity, but Shona is not. The best Harries teams are the ones that are going to be able to function effectively no matter what member goes down. But that's not always the way the cookie crumbles. So what you need to do is you need to understand what the best outcomes are, what models you can afford to lose, and pilot it in a way that if something goes wrong, you've got a crumple zone that you can afford to take. So, how's this cookie going to crumble? The first thing I want to look at is I want to look at every member in this team. And I want to see the outcomes if one of the members dies. So in the first example here, we've got a Vargar heavy rocket launcher and the Vargar FTO, who are our shooter and our specialist, but Shona has died. The outcome of this is that the team maintains Fireteam bonuses and have most of its offensive capabilities. The only thing they're really lacking is that close combat threat. They can still likely achieve their main purpose as a fire team and get the secondary objectives like pressing buttons done. This overall is a very good outcome if we were to lose one model. The next one we have is if the Vargar heavy rocket launcher dies, where all that's left over is the Vargar specialist and Shona Carano. Now this team does lose its bonuses, but they're still able to effectively operate, moving up the board, capturing objectives, and even getting a close combat underway if they can be successful enough. This is because the Vargar still has access to its specialist skills, and has a disco baller that can cover for the team super jumping up the table. Even though we've lost the capability of long-range firepower, we're still able to have quite a good game plan and get quite good outcomes despite the loss of the Vargar heavy rocket launcher. So this is a fine outcome. Now the last one we have here is if that Vargar specialist goes down. If this happens, the team loses its fireteam bonuses, they'll struggle to advance under enemy fire, because the Vargar HRL won't be on great dice, just being burst 2, and neither of them have access to visibility control, which will mean they're going to struggle to get to buttons or take any other kind of offensive action. This is a very bad outcome. So now we can see a very clear, tiered system where if Shona goes down, that's actually completely fine. If the heavy rocket launcher goes down, okay, we change gears a little bit, but we're still very likely to get some kind of outcome in the game. And then if that specialist Vargur dies, we're in a lot of trouble. So what does this mean? It means we've identified that the Vargur Disco Baller is probably the most important in the team. The worst outcomes happen when that Vargur dies. Also, we can see that Shona is probably the least important member of that team. If a unit dies and it's Shona, that leads to the best outcomes. If, say we have to have a model disappear, we would likely choose Shona, as it results in the best outcome for who's left in the team. So we've identified who's most important, who's least important, and then we've got a troop in the middle. So what you can do now is pilot that Haris team, and pilot that list, so that you've got a crumple zone that leads you to those good outcomes. Here we have on the left kind of a mock layering of how you might set yourself up defensively, where the first unit you want your opponent to hit is Shona. She's able to template or shoot anyone who comes around on her. She has the potential to dodge into close combat, and it's very risky to close combat herself, so she's quite a good filter. Ideally, you could end up in a situation where Shona and the other model trades, and that's perfectly fine. Shona's been your crumple zone. From what you've got left, you have a good outcome. Now let's say they make it past Shona and hit the next Vargur. The next Vargur has a light shotgun and a flash pulse, where he's likely going to be able to put up a pretty decent face-to-face if something has gotten past Shona. Hopefully, if it's a 2-wound model that's gone past Shona, Shona would have managed to do a wound, and now you can try fairly well to protect yourself. Now, if that second Vargur dies and it goes to the Vargur specialist and that specialist dies, oh well, these things happen. But if we set up our positioning this way, a fair amount of the time we should have an outcome where only Shona dies, or only Shona and the Vargur heavy rocket launcher die, leaving our fast specialist with vision control. The key to this is identifying the key unit in the link and creating a tier for least important, most important, and the middle. This way you can set yourself a really good crumple zone. So we're going to play a bit of a game now. On the screen we've got 3 of our other fire teams we've had a look at in this episode. I want you to pause the video, go down to the comments, and tell me who's the key member in each of these fire teams and why. I'll wait just a sec. Alright, let's take a look. So first up, in the middle fire team, it's fairly obvious. It's Deferzen. The fire team type is sort of a linchpin fire team where Deferzen is the linchpin. You can afford to lose either of the Teutonic Knights and keep Deferzen at quite a high operating capacity. Deferzen is also just quite a good solo piece as well, where that previous Vargur team, if you lose Shona and the HRL Vargur, the last Vargur can still get things done but is heavily defanged, where in this case with the Military Orders fire team, you lose both Teutons, Deferzen can still get quite a bit done on his own. In this case, the Teutonic Knight with the Tinbot is your middle most valuable, where the regular Teuton without any Tinbot, he's going to be your least valuable. So there we can see a very clear hierarchy. The same is also true for the Tunguska fire team, where it's very obvious that Miranda is not the key member. The whole design of that fire team is with the understanding that Miranda will die, and then what's left as a duo can go out and do its thing. Between Perseus and the Stemplar, I'd say Perseus takes the edge as the key member, filling 2 roles as both the shooter and the spice. But this could be dependent on the mission. Maybe you really need that specialist that the Stemplar brings, and if you layer Percy before the Stemplar, it is more likely that Percy could stem an attack run than the Stemplar. But I think Percy is overall the more important unit out of the 2. Then last up in this Corregidor fire team, it's a little bit different, because I think you can make the argument for a lot of units in that team. The heavy machine gun could be considered the key unit, because if Jazz dies, you still got a good duo, and if the other mobile brigada dies, you still got a heavy machine gun which is a weapon that doesn't necessarily need that special die, and you've got Jazz who can get a mission done. You could also argue it's the Tinbot Mobile Regatta, as it gives Jazz that really nice Tinbot, and it forms that pure duo with the Mobile Regatta. But really, I think it's Jazz for a couple reasons. The first one is the Mobile Regatta are both better at taking attacks than Jazz is, and can trade fairly well with boarding pistols. Additionally, while the heavy machine gun's a good gun piece, if both of the units die, Jazz is still able to cybermask and move up the table, and get a mission done, or just hang out in the deployment zone and do some hacking. The key member can also be the one who will be most effective when the rest of the fire team is wiped out. In that case, it's not going to be that Timbot -6 Mobile Regatta. It's not going to really do anything on its own. You might get a couple points there with the heavy machine gun Mobile Regatta, but I think Jazz is the most important there, and in the wider context of your list, in a Corregidor list, Jazz is likely to be more important. And this brings us to another point. Who the key member is going to change depending on the list, depending on the faction, and even depending on the mission. When we look back towards Perseus and the Stemplar like I mentioned before, this Haris team's key member can change from mission to mission. In Annihilation, it's absolutely Perseus, but maybe in something like Supremacy if you really need a button pressed, or something like Highly Classified where you need that forward observer or sensor to get something done, then that Stemplar is going to be the key member of that team. So let's look at the key takeaways. You need to be sure to build for failure. If the team can't handle failure, it might not be a good fire team. The second thing is to identify the key units in the team. This allows you to pilot. And now let's take a look at some key takeaways. You want to be sure to build for failure. If the team can't handle failure, it might not be a good fire team. You need to identify the key units in the team, which allows you to pilot the list, so that if you are going to lose a unit, or if there's an attack run incoming, you've got a good crumple zone where you can engineer a more ideal outcome for the team. You want to ask, how good are the other units at defending the key unit? We're looking at things like templates, close combat weapons, shotguns, mine laying, even turrets. You want to ask yourself, if an attack run comes and I've got this crumple zone, who's also best equipped to handle that oncoming attack? So you want to take these mental steps when you're building a Haris team. What are the outcomes for each individual member dying, like we did with the Vargr team? What outcomes best match the team's primary function? What other outcomes still allow for the team to fulfill a secondary function or change gears effectively? And the last thing I'll mention is this. Different units will be weak to different things. Let's say you were running a fire team of a Helot, Patsy Garrett, and a Nice in Vanilla Pano. Really, Patsy Garrett is the key member of that team, and she's quite weak to hacking. So make sure if you've got a key member who's particularly weak to hacking, maybe put a hacker near them or firewall, or if your key member is weak to templates, set up something where you can intercept before that. Be mindful of what the key member's specific weaknesses are. And on that note, thank you very much for watching, and please leave your general thoughts down below. Again, for a deeper look at Haris teams and fire teams in general, go check out that Loss of Lieutenant episode, and we'll catch you again very soon. Bye-bye.